Today, I want to start with what some people might think is slightly uncomfortable, and that is most training isn't actually training. It's disguised as a demo, as a rushed walkthrough, or maybe something that's like a last-minute calendar invite 1 or 2 weeks before go live. And then we have leadership and executives wondering why our adoption is low, why are so many issues being raised, and why we have poor data quality. So in this session, I want to really talk about what does great Salesforce training actually look like. Not a fluffy version, not a, oh, we run a webinar and so we covered ourselves, but a kind of training that changes Salesforce from a technical system into a business performance tool. Because the truth is, if your training is a box-ticking exercise, your output, your adoption will give you box-ticking results. And that doesn't get us anywhere. So into this session, I want to talk a little bit about the structure behind great training, the planning that is required. I'll talk a little bit about role-based design, about exercises that make the difference between good and great training, and in the end, a little bit about delivering techniques that turn resistant to Salesforce into confident users. And here's the number one mistake I come across a lot when I talk with organizations. People think training starts when the slide deck is created. And that's just wrong. Great training starts at the beginning of the project. Be it your implementation, your big rollout, be it your big change you're making, or even your regular sprint releases. Training should not be considered a one-off event. It needs to be a strategy that is constantly there year in, year out. And then before you can even start talking about training, the very first thing, the fundamental thing you need to do is a training needs analysis. Because good training is not generic. It's not everybody has the same needs and get the same kind of training. In a good training needs analysis, you answer some of these questions. What does your sales team actually do on a day-to-day basis? What does our service team, our call center need? What is the visibility that our manager need? Are there any processes changing? What is old versus new system? And are there any current skills gaps in our user base? And there's a couple of critical elements that companies always miss. You're not talking just about an analysis of the system functionality. You also need to consider people behavior. What are they struggling with today? What are their pain points? What are they avoiding? What are they not really understanding on what they need to do? Because if you don't understand user behavior, the training is not going to fix that. The second thing that is really important for good training is having clear objectives. What is the reason why we're running training? For example, a good training objective could be, after this session, this person should be able to comfortably do X, Y, and Z without any help. You shouldn't have the generic things like, oh, they just understand the system. We should answer questions like, they can create an opportunity correctly. They can log a case properly. They can run and interpret their own reporting. We need to make sure our objectives are specific, measurable, and relevant. Now, to make sure that we know if training is good, we of course have to also define some success metrics. Training should be measurable. But for example, what we can look at is things like adoption rate, data completeness, a reduction in errors, fewer support tickets, maybe even manager feedback. So if you can't define success of training, we can't improve in it. And training should be constantly evolving, constantly changing. Not just because our Salesforce changes, but also because maybe our users changes, there's need changes. And let me be very clear. If you train everybody in exactly the same way, the impact is going to be rubbish. Because a sales rep doesn't need what a sales manager needs. An advisor doesn't need what an executive needs. So great Salesforce training needs to be role-based by design. And for example, here, what we talk about is for frontline users. What are the day-to-day tasks? We make sure there is a step-by-step execution of what they need to do. Make sure there's hands-on repetition. What to do when something goes wrong. When we talk about managers, we need to start talking about dashboards, pipeline visibility. How can they use Salesforce as a coaching tool? How do they interpret the data? And for an executive level, we can start thinking about, okay, What does our reporting look like? How confident are we in the data that's in the reporting? You can start looking at KPI tracking. How can we use the data that's in Salesforce through reports and dashboards? Make sure we have strategic insights in it. And what is our governance around everything that we're doing? You don't want to mix that all into one session, because then nobody gets what they need. People will get really confused and they come out and think, like, I still don't know why we have Salesforce and what I need to do. Because when training feels irrelevant for your users, they will get disengaged. If it's specific to their world, they will really start to lean in and start learning and start really engaging in the training. And then they will remember what they need to do when they go into the system. Now, where transformation is really happening is not in slides. We all know the phrase death by PowerPoint. That is no different for training. If your training is 200 slides in a PowerPoint deck, you're not doing training. Where training really makes the difference is in scenarios, in exercise, in real life application. So when we talk about great Salesforce training, the very first thing we talk about is what are realistic scenarios. Not like, oh, click here, you can create an opportunity for this company. For example, what a good scenario is, a project calls a sales rep and says, this is what I need. So as a sales rep, what I need to do then, log the call, qualify the project, then create an opportunity, move them through these stages, update the steps, all the way from beginning to the end. And make sure that that process in Salesforce mirrors their day-to-day exercises. Because then it feels real. Then it feels something that will stick to them. Because if it's artificial, they're not going to bother, they're not going to remember. Probably the number one thing also in training, and I can't talk about that enough, is hands-on practice. You can't ignore that in any good Salesforce training. If you just have people watching somebody click around and show it to them, they're not really learning. They're observing. The way for people to learn Salesforce is actually by doing it. And by doing it, they might make mistakes and they will correct themselves. They then get an explanation why the mistake was there and how they can avoid it in the future. They learn by repeating their actions, by constantly over and over doing the same things. Hands-on time in any training should be at least 50% of a session. And so if you as a team want to roll out training, you need to make sure you have anything that is needed for that. User setup, orgs, data, etc. Now, the other thing you then need in good training is having make sure you enforce data standards. So when we talk about people doing something in the system, like create an opportunity, what we then need to talk about in there is what does good data look like? What does a good, nice, completed opportunity in the system look like? Why do we have certain fields and what is the importance of them? What happens if data is incomplete? Do they just get an error message or can they just pass it? But if that happens, what's the impact of our reporting? How important is anything they do in the system throughout the whole organization for their own KPIs, for business KPIs, for business strategy planning? I talk about that in one of my previous sessions. Because if you do this all well, that is when you start building accountability amongst your users. That's how you make sure you have clean data. That's also how you can prepare for the future of API accountability. Because AI doesn't fix around bad input, training does. Now let's start talking a little bit about delivery. Because even if you have fantastic content and you did a lot of hands-on exercises, if your delivery is poor, your training is not going to land. So how do I think about good delivery? Well, the first thing is think about group sizes. If you have 40, 50 people on a call or in a room, there's not going to be interaction. You're basically broadcasting, and that again is not training. What's really important is a sort of bite-sized small sessions. Because smaller groups allow for questions, for coaching, for real-time correction, and for engaging. When I talk about groups, I talk about sort of 12 or 15 people maximum. And when you talk about groups, think about the makeup of the group. We already talked about that you have to make it different between, for example, sales and service. So you make sure your groups are not mixed. But then also talk about the type of roles in a group. Do you want to have, for example, your managers in the group? I've had training where we said, okay, we don't want the manager in the training because users will not give honest feedback if the manager is in the group. They're sort of afraid to speak up because they don't want to come across like, oh, I don't know something. I always have these questions. So then in those cases, if that's in your organization, you have a separate manager sessions. But maybe the other flip side of it, you actually want the managers in the training because they then understand what the issues are amongst your users, amongst their reps, and they can then help making further sure that Salesforce really gets embedded and help them overcoming the issues that they might have. It's something that you really need to think about that. And from that is also, we have to make sure we build a safe learning environment. If people think they're judged and being sort of frowned upon and looked upon, they're not going to ask questions. So if you have a great trainer, they do things like, yeah, you can be confused. There might be a mistake, but that is fine. That is how you learn. A good training makes sure you invite discussion and you remove the fear that any users might be having. Because confidence will grow when trust and safety exists. And one of the other big things about good training is also energy and clarity. Because for most users, the very first time they log into Salesforce, it can be really overwhelming. I've said it before, people like admins, developers, us in the technical world, for us Salesforce, we are in there day in, day out, and we don't think it's complex. But for a lot of users, it's a big difference between what they did before and what they're going to do. And so therefore, all these buttons, all these pages, all these fields can really feel overwhelming. And so the best job a trainer can do is simplify this. Break it down, break down the complexity, break it down in simple steps. And make sure we use plain language, avoid jargon. It's so easy to start using technical language. And that is what users don't understand. If we talk, for example, about accounts, is that something that your organization uses, or do they talk about things like customers? A good trainer translates what the system looks like to what the user actually understands and the things they use on a day-to-day basis. Now, throughout training, repetition is the best thing you can do. Don't just give them one exercise. Give them 10, give them 15. Let them go in and keep going and keep going. And then make sure we go through different scenarios. We create an opportunity and then we go through the stage and we have closed one. Then we create another opportunity and we go through closed lost. What are the differences? What is happening? So have a lot of these different scenarios within your training. Make sure you have different contexts that you apply. Maybe you get something in by a call or maybe in a meeting. Think about all the different ways that information can go through use and then into the system. And make sure that you sort of reinforce key actions. Do we expect them to always log a call or always send an email or always update certain information? In any scenario, if that's the important, make sure that every scenario reinforces those actions. Now, there's another big myth that often hangs around training, and that is once we've gone live, training is done. It's not. Training is actually ongoing. Users were learning from the moment we go live. Before that, they were just playing around. They were exploring, they were starting to understand the system. The real training starts the moment they start using Salesforce on a day-to-day basis. And so to make sure that Salesforce is therefore and training is your ongoing strategy, things you have to start thinking about is, for example, refresher sessions. Maybe in the first week of go live, and then maybe after 30 or 60 days, have a reflection and say, what is working at the moment? What are your users confused with? What are the mistakes that are constantly happening? And how you deal with it then is things like arrange some short sessions, some short videos. Maybe you use tip sheets. Maybe you use things like frequently asked questions. The other thing we can think about is our super user development or our champions. Who are those key players that we had identified that can really help us elevate our Salesforce experience? Make sure we identify those users, upskill them even further, really make sure they get embedded further into the Salesforce, into the project, so they become this spokesperson between your users and the technical team. So they really become the people that are at the front of the system and really can drive your Salesforce adoption along your user base. What's really important is building feedback loops. Make sure you regularly ask questions. Things like, what is good? What is bad? Is there anything that is really complicated for your users? Do we have things that are actually unnecessary? Are we asking people to do things and actually, after maybe a month, we figure out we actually don't want to do that anymore, or it's too complex? Training evolves with the system on an ongoing basis. The important thing is when we do training well, why we see that is users will stop blaming the system. Managers will start trusting the reporting, our data will improve, the user confidence will increase, the resistance will decrease, and there's then this ongoing shift that Salesforce is no longer that extra admin. It's really going to be like, right, this is what I do on a day-to-day basis, and this is how we as an organization run our business. And that is transformation. We then no longer talk about just system knowledge, we talk about capability, ownership, and clarity. So to end this session with the following is that if your Salesforce training currently looks like things like a generic webinar, no role separation, maybe no hands-on training, no follow-up, no measurement, no long-term strategy beyond your go live, then you really don't have a training strategy. You then just have a calendar entry and that's it. If you really want to start making sure your Salesforce start delivering ROI and getting ready to AI capabilities, you really have to make sure that your Salesforce training becomes a strategy. And that starts with people, with structure, relevance, repetition, and intention. And great Salesforce training in itself isn't really expensive, but bad training is. And that's the key takeaway of this session. Hope you enjoyed this. Looking forward to see you next time.